Hello, everyone. Welcome to the space. We'll just be getting started here in a few moments while we get Marcel, Michael, and Denise on the stage. Hello, Michael. Hello, Marcel. Hey, Marcel. Hey, Marcel. Hey, Michael. Welcome to the stage, both of you. Just give me a moment here for Denise to get in, and then we can get started.
Okay, I don't even see Michael, so I'm in the Matrix apparently.
He was connecting. He's probably trying to get
Oh,
in.
okay,
Just give it a
okay. Oh,
second.
so he is it. Okay.
Okay, hold on just a second.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, Denise. I'm going to invite you to co-host now. Michael was just in the space. He may have gotten caught in the matrix and come right back in, but we'll get him on the stage. I'll turn it over to you, Denise. And hey, Michael, I see you in the audience. I just sent you an invite to speak. If you could request again, that would be great. We'll get you back up here.
Hey, Denise.
Greetings. Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Fab,
Uh,
fab. Hey,
hey, Denise, can you?
Alexis.
Hey,
Yeah, can
girl,
you
can
hear
you hear
me?
me?
Yeah, I can. Loud and clear. Loud and
Great.
clear.
I see Michael down in the audience. He had requested and I brought him up, but he was having a problem connecting. I'm going to try to bring him back up again.
Okay.
But I'll turn it over to you. You can do all the talking. I'll just try to get him back up here real quick.
Okay, sounds good. So, thank you everybody for joining. I am super excited for this conversation tonight. Hello, Marcel, Michael. This is an important conversation for the descendant of slave freedmen community and the Black community at large. So, you know how we do with these spaces that we have, semi-structured, but structured for sure. So let's get into it. This space is really a Twitter debate with Gregg Marcel Dixon and Michael Harriot. Today's debate centers on should reparations for slavery be race-based or lineage-based. So, for context, as many of you know, the discussion about slavery reparations had received increased public attention over the last 10 years, but especially the last 5 in the United States. That momentum has really been driven by the grassroots, by a combination of stakeholders, including the ADOS movement and the active folks there, the grassroots foundational Black American conversation, the freedmen advocacy organizations around the country, CJAC and the NASASD, and unaffiliated descendants of slaves who've written about it, lobbied legislators at the national, state, local levels, and people who are in social media just having the conversation and normalizing the idea of reparations for slavery in our lifetime. So, in addition to that, a legacy organizations who've been involved for a while, like in Cobra and NARC, have experienced a resurgence in their political capital around a diasporian or race-based approach to reparations. And then, of course, there are things that are happening at the international level as well. So, but we are focused on the United States and reparations in this context. So, there are three reparations actions that have captured the public's attention. You're likely familiar with H.R. 40, which is the national level legislation written to establish a task force to study the impact of slavery and take a look at what could be done there. It's important to note that H.R. 40 had languished since 1989 at the local, and they still haven't seated the task force. So at the local level, you'll recall that we've seen the housing voucher program in Evanston, Illinois, which had fairly recently, had its lottery that sought to give quote unquote reparations to Black Americans who experienced housing discrimination. And if you know anything about Evanston, you know Evanston is a very wealthy city with high-end real estate there. Just as a side note, that bit of legislation is now facing a legal battle with Judicial Watch, who is well known for dismantling or seeking to get legislation thrown out that is focused on any kind of race, gender, all of those types of things. And then, of course, at the state level, we have California's Assembly Bill 3121, or AB 3121. It's a bill that seated a task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. So recently, of course, that task force voted to approve the following motion. They wanted to define the community of eligibility based on lineage determined by an individual being an African American descendant of a chattel enslaved person or the descendant of a free Black person living in the United States prior to the end of the 19th century. So we're here today to sort of pull that apart. Reparations in general, what it has looked like so far in these conversations, what Michael and Marcel feel it should look like. We're going to anchor this conversation in Michael's recent article at the Griot titled The Top 10 Reasons Why Lineage-Based Reparations is a Bad Plan. And we're also going to anchor this in Marcel's contribution to the public comments for AB 3121, his advocacy for reparations, and the call to action for his political campaign, which is really about repairing Black America to fix America. So we'll have him dig into that. So a couple housekeeping things. This is a single night event. We have these guys for 60 to 90 minutes. This is a debate between them and the moderator, so we will not have a Q&A, though you are welcome to tweet out any questions you have. You can DM Alexis or me if you have any questions that you would like to have posed in addition to the questions we've already prepared. The way this is going to work is this is, of course, a civil discussion, but no buts. And in the course of being civil and listening to each other, we often get passionate and we speak how we speak. And again, it is family, but the goal here is to clarify the issue and to share insights from different perspectives so that we can broaden our thinking, as well as hear what others have to say as we're continuing to engage in this conversation, because reparations is going to happen. So if you are in the room, please share the space, tweet out that you are here, invite others to come in. And as we're having this conversation, if a particular comment strikes you and you want to share it with others, please tweet that from the space so others can come join and listen to this conversation as well. This conversation will be recorded and it will be available to you on Twitter for 30 days. So here's the other piece, as you know, I always say, the public servant's announcement, because technology is technology. If for some reason Twitter Spaces prematurely closes, you can head to my Twitter profile or to Alexis's actually, so that you can receive a link to the reopen room. We'll probably label it something like Take Two Marcel and Michael, so that you can get back in here and we can pick up wherever we leave off. But as I always say, hopefully the first time is the charm. So enough from me. Let's introduce our esteemed speakers today because we are ready to get into it. So Michael Harriot, welcome, is a writer, cultural critic, and championship level spades player. His book, Black AF History, The Unwashed Story of America, will be released in 2022. Michael, let the folks hear your voice. Welcome to the space.
Hey, and thanks for having me. I don't think I could have done any better of a introduction to this conversation than you did. So I'm just saying thank you for having me.
Glad you are here. Thank you. All right, and then we have Mr. Gregg Marcel Dixon. Gregg Marcel Dixon is an educator and candidate for U.S. Congressional District Number 6 in South Carolina. Go ahead and welcome and say hi to the people, Marcel.
Hey everyone, and I just want to say to Michael, when it comes to spades, you don't want none of this. So we'll talk about that. That'll be another one.
Fabulous. All right. So let's dig in here. Marcel, we'll start with you and then we'll toss it to Michael to address this opening question. As we're in this community talking about reparations and all of that, can you tell the listener about your connection to slavery in the United States and what more you'd like them to know about your background related to reparations and in general?
Well, thank you, Denise. I'm Gullah Geechee, which means I'm the descendant of the Africans that were enslaved on the coast of South Carolina. And Michael made mention to this. South Carolina was once one of the richest places in the world. Of course, the people there, the majority being black, were not rich because they were enslaved. But our rice growing, indigo growing, iron blacksmithing abilities made it a very, very wealthy place, one of the wealthiest in the world. And right now, as we speak, I have property from what some will say was the first act of reparations that this government did for Black Americans who are descendants of those enslaved by the American government. Port Royal experiment, I have property from that in my family in the Beaufort area and Ladies Island. And I also have property from Special Field Order 15 here in my hometown of Ridgeland, South Carolina. So when I go to my grandfather's house to get my hair retwisted by my cousin, I feel like I'm stepping on sacred ground. And I don't go to the property in Beaufort or Ladies Island much, but when I do go there, I'm like, this is really history. So it's a personal connection that's literally in my family, as with many people here in the Low Country.
Fantastic. Thank you. Michael, I want to toss it to you with the same question. Talk about your connection to slavery in the United States and what more you'd like folks to know about you and your background in general or reparations in particular.
Yeah. So I feel like uh, Marcel kind of introduced me to. I am also a descendant of enslaved people in South Carolina, Gullah Geechee. My paternal grandmother's side was enslaved on James Island in South Carolina. And which is, for people not from South Carolina, that is essentially what a lot of people would call Charleston. It's right outside of Charleston. And my maternal grandmother's people and my maternal grandfather's people were enslaved. And uh, it was called the Old Salem District. It is Sumter, on the border of Sumter and Lee County in South Carolina. Uh, and like Marcel, my sister and my mother live on Special Water 15 property in right outside of Moncks Corner, South Carolina. And my family is still, most of my family is still in South Carolina. So when I uh, went to graduate school, I taught a course. Created and taught a course for years called Race as an Economic Construct, which is the first, which was in the late 90s, the mid to late 90s. And it was the first time, I had been engaged in the conversation about reparations. You know, there wasn't a lot of literature. What everybody wasn't on the internet. There was no social media back then. But the idea of reparations, was something that I've studied and written about since then. So that is my connection to enslaved people and to the reparations argument.
Excellent. What is the likelihood that we would have two Gullah Geechee descendants having this conversation? Seems incredibly appropriate to me. All right. So let's get started here. Michael, we're going to start this one with you. And here's the question. So, in 2 minutes or less, can you tell us how you define reparations? And can you tell us what is the purpose of reparations? 2 to 3 minutes.
So, in my opinion, reparations are the. I like to frame the conversation as the dividends that are due to the people whose labor and intellectual aptitude was invested in America since the beginning. So I never frame it as, giving Black people reparations, or it is what we are owed. We have invested not just our sweat equity and our labor, and I always like to make that important point, but our intellectual property and our financial property. And that is why I do not think that reparations should be limited just to slavery. Because if you think about when we're talking about South Carolina, for instance, until the 1940s, South Carolina was a majority Black state. The majority of taxpayers in South Carolina were paying taxes, and their money was being used to build generational wealth for white people. Their money was given to 7 white colleges when integration was illegal. So all of the white people who went to college in South Carolina before 1940 and probably until the 1960s were going to college on Black people's money, went to colleges that we couldn't attend. So that is how I like to frame the argument. That is my interpretation. That is how I view reparations. And I guess my 2 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you. Marcel, how do you define reparations and what's the purpose of reparations to you?
Reparations for Black Americans who are descendants of American slaves is for the same reason as it was for the Japanese Americans who were interned, for the settlements that were made to Native Americans, for restitution that is still being paid to Holocaust survivors. It is to pay back and to repair damage that was done and to pay a debt because of wrongs that were inflicted on a particular group. So reparations is a payment of a debt that this country, the United States of America, owes to Black Americans who are freedmen. That is our legislative term, freedmen, descendant of those who were enslaved by the American government and emancipated at the end of the Civil War. It's for unpaid wages that our ancestors should have inherited, but also for the damages and for the lost opportunities through redlining, Jim Crow, the Federal Housing Authority, the housing covenants, the destruction of Black Wall Streets, and land theft. Reparations is a payment on that debt.
Michael, do you have a response to what Marcel just said? Because there are parts of your article that maybe speaks to some of his point about wages and such. I don't want to set you up for a response, but when he was speaking, that came to mind for me, and I'm curious to know if you had a rebuttal.
Right, I do, and I agree largely with everything that he says. And I think the difference between our arguments is that I think that debt is larger, right? So if you're talking about the unpaid wages, I totally agree. But I also agree that that debt extends past slavery, extends past emancipation, and extends, really, it's up until the end of to 1976. Is my end point when the Federal Banking Act was passed. Because before then, if we're focusing on the economic aspect of it, right? The wage, not just the wages, but the investments. You're talking about the GI Bill that Marcel mentioned, right? The African Americans who fought for this country are still due that money. If you're talking about redlining, that those effects still linger until today, which is why I am sometimes reluctant to kind of even into that 1976, because there are people, there's a Brookings Institute report that shows that, the average difference between white and black homes, the identical homes in a white neighborhood and a black neighborhood is about $48,000. And that is because of redlining. And so the way this country was constructed is due. And the important part about what we're talking about is this, right? So if you're talking about after slavery, there are, in every instance that Marcel and I just mentioned, the Supreme Court or legislatures have already said, "Oh, you did it wrong," but they didn't give compensation as they did for any other civil case that would have ensued during that time, right? So if you're talking about Brown versus Board of Education, which a lot of people don't know, the first that was 5 cases. The first of which originated in Summerville, South Carolina, where a majority black town was paying for 35 school buses for a white school, and their kids did not have a school bus. Some of their children would drown on the way to school periodically. And so I think when we limit it just to wages and just to unpaid wages, we do a disservice to ourselves. And we kind of, I think, let America off the hook for all of the damages that we have incurred.
Thank you, Michael. Marcel?
So, as I stated in my opening statement, reparations starts with chattel slavery. It starts with the people who, as Michael knows, down here in South Carolina, were working in those rice plantations, which has some of the highest death rates in all of the Americas, who were growing the indigo, who were smithing the iron, who built the structure of cities like Charleston and Savannah, two of the wealthiest places in the world at the time of during slavery. But it by no means stops there. I've already went through, and I'm just going to repeat. It continues with the failure of Reconstruction, the mass lynching that happened. It continued with police brutality, the destruction of Black Wall Streets. And we talk about Black Wall Streets, but there were also Black prosperous towns that were destroyed by white mob violence. The number one cause of lynching was land theft. It continues with the fact that Black soldiers, like my great grandfather, who is still alive, fought to free the Jews from Hitler's regime, and he was deprived of the money he should have gotten via the GI Bill. So all he had to pass down to his daughter, my grandmother, was poverty, and all she had to pass down to her son, my father, was poverty. But those things were not done, as you argue in your article, Michael, to Black immigrants. That is a debt. Those are betrayals that this country specifically did to freed men, Black Americans who are of non-immigrant background, people who are enslaved by this country. At the end of the Civil War, were supposed to have this country reconstructed. And in that reconstruction, we were supposed to have resources, wages, land, and housing. This country did none of that. They betrayed us, the Republican Party, with the compromise in the 1870s. That is what reparations is for. Reparations is not to solve the issue of racism or even anti-blackness. It is to pay a debt. In my household, if I break a mug and I try to repair that mug, I'm not going to go around and try to repair all the mugs. I'm going to repair the one that I damaged, because that is the one that I broke and I need to fix. Likewise, this centuries long terrorism that was burnt by Black Americans before 1965. It was basically no Black immigrants in the United States of America. And the claim for reparations generally goes from 1776 to 1965 with the enactment of civil rights legislation. They said that what they were doing were wrong and they stopped it on paper. Now they have to make restitution for it that they stopped.
Let's dig into that a little bit there. So there are a couple of themes that I hear you both saying. One is around the timing that reparations should encapsulate. The United States paying reparations should encapsulate, right? There's this idea of 1619 or before, 1776, but then there's this open debate about the end date of that, right? Of where the harm happened. So there's that piece. And the other piece there that I think is embedded within that question about timing is the idea of the ongoing effects of slavery and who those ongoing effects affected and who is covered by that when it comes to reparations. So, Michael, can you speak to your thoughts both on the timing, the beginning and theoretical end date, as well as the legacy of slavery and who is covered by it from a reparatory justice standpoint?
Sure. I think we all agree on the beginning date, right? You know, when the first Black people stepped foot in America. And as far as the end date, right? So I think, you know, speaking to Marcel's point, I don't think we can disassociate the country and anti-Blackness and racism from what happened to the descendants of slaves and even Black immigrants. Now, I would agree, and I think most people who have studied this issue would agree that the comparison between what happened to slaves and immigrants, you know, there's a economic difference, there is a socioeconomic difference between the two, but it doesn't. I don't think that American laws that cause the ongoing discrimination, such as redlining, such as the GI Bill, so differentiated between the two, right? And so I think we let America off the hook if we say, oh, you don't got to worry about that other stuff. It and my ultimate point is about the ongoing effects and the end date of slavery. When we talk about, for instance, the GI Bill, right, and the people who fought in World War I and World War II, many of those people were immigrants because that was a way to become an American citizen. So that debt includes immigrants. When we talk about redlining, right, even today, you know, Black immigrants are more likely to live in Black neighborhoods than any other population of immigrants, and even more so than second and third and fourth generation Americans going on Black. When we look at the economic statistics, and I think that everybody who's looked at the data would agree that immigrants who come to America have it better off because they don't suffer the vestiges of slavery. But what we also see in the data is by the third and fourth generation, it for Black immigrants and not for any other group of immigrants, not for white immigrants, not for Hispanic immigrants. When by the third and fourth generation, the children of Black immigrants suffer the same consequences of living in America as everyone else. They are as likely to be incarcerated. They are as likely to live in a red line area. They are as likely to suffer the unequal funding of schools. So what it shows me is that what America does can't be kind of separated. What America does to Black people can't be separated. Now, I would agree with Marcel that, and even with the California bill, that there should be a special consideration for African American descendants of slaves. And I don't think that anybody would argue that, right? Because the longer you've been here in this country, the more likely you are to have suffered these inequalities that America produces specifically for Black people.
Thank you, Michael. Marcel, your thoughts on the question?
So I want to start off asking Michael a question. I know you can't answer right now. The claims conference, that is the body that distributes to this day reparations for Jewish people. I'm looking at what they have here. In order for a person to be eligible, it doesn't say you have to have been of Jewish descent living in Europe. It says you have to have proven that you were harmed by the Nazis. You lost property. When America first, at the end of World War II, before reparations were paid to Jewish people, the United States military, they actually already started making Germany West Germany pay reparations. Do you know what they did? They made them give back the property to any Jewish person from whose property they've stolen. Now, did they go around and give property to all Jewish people who were probably living in West Germany, but were fortunate enough not to be put in the concentration camps? No, they only addressed the people who were harmed. Until this day, the claims conference only pays reparations to people who are spouses or who are survivors of the Holocaust, not to all Jews. Likewise with the Japanese. Japanese received reparations, and it was not even, some of them were not even alive at the time. They had passed away by the time reparations were done in the 1980s. But I'm looking at their qualifications right now as we speak. It has to be a Japanese person who was interned. Now, according to the data, 80% of Japanese Americans were interned in internment camps during World War II, but not all of them were. Now, you can believe the reason the Japanese were interned, because America at that time was dealing with a time of yellow panic when there was pretty much xenophobia towards Asian people. So we can all imagine that there were Japanese people, there were probably even Korean people and Chinese people who were probably dealing with anti Asian sentiment every single day, right? But those people did not receive reparations. Only the Japanese who were interned. You do not get paid reparations because you chose to come to a country whose history you know is anti-black. Our claim for reparations is not to make white people like black people. It's not even to solve all the problems in this society. It's to make this country pay the debt that it was supposed to pay and probably would have paid had Abraham Lincoln not been assassinated. Those 40 acres in a mule, they weren't going to be given out to people who were living in Jamaica at the time. They were going to be given to the same people who were emancipated at the end of the Civil War. In Savannah, Georgia, which you know, because I'm in original South Carolina, I know you know where I am, is only 25 minutes from me. General Sherman met with 20 pastors. When General Sherman asked them, what can we do to right the wrongs that we've done to the Negro? They say, give us the land that we cultivated. Black immigrants that come here are coming to a land that they did not build. They are not the persons who inherit the debt. Let me tell you, I have heirs property in my family. You probably do too, being that you're from James Allen. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. That land was bequeathed to us, right? Well, we still have to pay the taxes on that land. My family has paid tens of thousands of dollars to keep heirs property. We inherit the debt of paying for property from which we cannot get a single dime. Likewise, the United States of America has inherited the debt of paying what they should have paid to our ancestors. What sense does it make that an immigrant whose ancestor was not enslaved here can come here now all of a sudden and say the debt should be paid to them as well? No. If we want to deal with issues that are impacting black people generally, we can do legislation for that. But reparations here, this is for America to pay its debt that it owes to the group of people for whom they still have not paid, and that is black Americans of non-immigrant background, no one else.
So I want to make sure that I establish a couple things based on what you just said, Marcel. So with the California AB 3121 bill, or with the task force voting, the motion that they approved, what, Michael, can you mute your mic? And if we could all keep our mics muted while others are speaking, we'll have less feedback, and then the audience will be able to hear us better, is what I understand from people's feedback. Thank you. So what the task force for AB 3121 had just voted on is they approved the motion to limit reparations to descendants of chattel enslaved persons who, or free blacks who were here before the end of the 19th century. So we're talking before 1901, right? So, Marcel, are you saying that that date fits, that cutoff date for having been in the United States fits with your concept of the timing for reparations?
Please repeat that again, Denise, because I'm kind of in the matrix.
No worries. So that at that 19th century cutoff date, being here, a free black person or a descendant of chattel enslaved person in the United States, being here before 19th century, so before 1901, fits your concept of that cutoff date for reparations for slavery, particularly.
The claim for me will go from 1776 to 1965. And may I say something real quick?
Of course.
I was watching Tiffany Cross. I know Michael Grandchild sometimes, and I saw she asked Kamala Moore about what if an immigrant came here 200 years ago. Well, if they came here 200 years ago, they will qualify for reparations because they will be descendants of American slavery. They would be freemen. So yes, I definitely do agree with that particular time. Okay.
And then, Michael, you'd mentioned when I asked about timing, you said a date that's when the first Black people stepped foot here. So can you give me an actual numerical response to that? What date is that you're speaking of?
So when there's a bunch of different dates. There are people we don't
Tell me the
know
earliest
who
one
came
that
here
you're
on
thinking of.
the expedition with Aeon, who had a slave revolt in 1526. And the white people went back and the Black people stayed. And a lot of people believe, there are historians who believe that those people are the Lumbee in North Carolina, on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina, in Dumbarton, North Carolina, specifically. So I would go back to the 1500s. If you can trace your lineage, and I don't think that anyone argues that there should be a special consideration for people who are descended from slaves, right? And I think we're kind of having two parallel conversations. Does America owe the descendants of slaves? And the answer to that question is yes. And then, does that debt that America owe to the descendant of slaves extend past slavery? And I think the answer would be yes. It was the vestiges of slavery did not just affect the descendants of slaves. Although I believe that if you are a descendant of slaves, you are due more simply because of the unpaid labor, right? But all of the things that Marcel mentioned, I believe, you can see happening. You can see the vestiges of those in the 1920s and the 1930s, when America had systemically extended slavery to its prison industrial complex, when America had systemically introduced the concept of segregation, and the defunding of Black wealth, when in the 1930s, when America gave the greatest uh, social program, created the greatest social program in the history of North America, the New Deal, and specifically excluded Black people. And the question is, and I think the difference between Marcel's argument and my argument is that when I consider reparations, I consider that also. And in my consideration includes everything that Marcel said. And the specific question that I have is like, why people are so adamant about the exclusion of people that after slavery experienced the same injustices from America, right?
Yeah, so there are a couple things, and then Marcel, I do want to toss it to you because that is the next question is
Thank
about the
you.
positioning about race-based versus lineage-based, and I think there are a couple things that I want to clear up first. And let me level set the room here. So this is a 60 to 90-minute conversation. We are not taking questions from the audience just because we are very, very limited on time. If you do have a question, please DM me or Alexis. And we will try to get your question and fold it into the conversation. I am so sorry. So there are a couple things. One, with AB 3121, it's not just that it's limiting it to the end, to the emancipation and the end of slavery, but it's talking about people who qualify for the reparatory justice from when America was a country, right? Because we can't account for when it was not. But in California, particularly, that those folks who qualify would have had an ancestor who would have been here in the enslavement era, and they would be the reparatory justice would include times post slavery because it's also taken into account the compounded legacy of anti-freedmen, anti-Black sentiment that was present after emancipation. So it's not just that it's covering just the time during slavery, but the people who experienced the compounded legacy of slavery were also at some point their people were enslaved. So it does continue beyond emancipation. But Michael, to your, and I hope that that's clearer. But Michael, to your point, that is the next question, which is why would reparations for slavery and the legacy of slavery include a vast number of people who were not here even before civil rights legislation was enacted, and they didn't bear the burden? Marcel, do you want to speak to the why you hold the position that you hold about lineage-based reparations versus race-based? I know you've said it, but let's say it again, and then I want to know why Michael feels that race-based is appropriate and the best route to go. And then we'll talk about legality.
Definitely. Okay, I was going to get to the legality argument anyway, but I want to say, Michael, I'm going to repeat again. My claim, the reparations, 1776, 1965, all the damages, all the wrong that was done to Black Americans, the debt is owed to Black Americans. Imagine, Michael, would you say to a Jewish person who survived the Holocaust, would you dare say to them that a Jewish person who moved to Germany just yesterday should get payments as well because anti-Semitism is still a problem? Would you dare say that to a Holocaust survivor? Would you dare say that? But people always feel comfortable saying that to Black Americans. Here's the thing. I want to speak to the legality, Denise. I'm just going to go there. We have two examples I want to point to. During the American Rescue Plan, they earmarked money to help farmers. They tried to say it was for Black, quote unquote, farmers. They really made it for Black, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Hispanics. They threw everyone in there. Now that aid is being held up in courts. And why? I want to read to y'all what the judge who filed an injunction against it said. I'm trying to click on what people are writing me and they're blocking my button. And she said right here, she said that to make it based on race and say that it's flexible, but not to have any other category for which a person could qualify for these funds is the antithesis of being flexible. In other words, what she is saying that race-based policies are too rigid and discriminatory, and that's why this aid for the Black farmers that was done last year is still being held up in courts. And I want to point you to another example. There's a case called Pigford versus Glickman. It started here in North Carolina, where Black farmers got together, around 400 of them, and they sued the USDA. And guess what? They didn't go there suing them saying they were being racist against Black people. They said that they were being racist against them. They came with evidence showing that they had faced discrimination because they were Black. They didn't sue for Black people to get treated right for the USDA. They sued for the USDA to pay for the loss on funding that they had experienced because the USDA discriminated against them, and they won their case. That right there is the problem. If we start trying to include everyone who really is not owed the debt and who are really not the ones that burnt the wrongdoing, our case will fall flat. It will not stand on constitutional grounds. I've looked at reparations for the Japanese. They never said you have to pay Japanese people. They say you have to pay Japanese people who are interned. The Cleans Conference that still handles reparations for Jewish people, and they deal with several countries. They deal with Austria. They deal with Germany. They deal with the Netherlands. They even deal with the United States of America. The criteria is not that you have to just be Jewish and you have to face anti-Semitism. It's that you have to be a survivor of the Holocaust or their spouse, or you could be a descendant of someone who filed, but they never got a response, or they died while their application was still being processed. We will be the only group to give away our exclusive claim to everyone who's quote unquote black, only to watch it go up in smokes on constitutional grounds. We have no grounds saying black people because the USA did not harm all black people. They harmed those 4 million people who were emancipated at the end of slavery. And like you, Michael, I know it goes past slavery. I always give the analogy of a house. If you have a house and the foundation has been damaged, and you continue to neglect the foundation is going to fall into further and further repair. Likewise, the USA should have paid that debt to our ancestors. Had they done that, we would have inherited that wealth. Because they have not done that, the deficit, the pain, the lack of opportunities we have experienced has increased tenfold, if not more. But that doesn't change the fact that we are the people to whom they hold the debt. Black Americans, y'all always tell us, and you write for the root and for the grill, y'all always say things like we have to save America or come out and save America. America ain't never turned out to save us. And the problem is this time here with reparations is Black Americans, freemen, who are saving ourselves. It is exclusive to us because the debt is owed to us.
Marcel, you shared a lot there. And Michael, I'm curious to know your thoughts on that. And I'm also, noting something that you and Marcel said in regard to including immigrants in your article, as well as data that's been shared out by multiple sources. Black immigrants generally come to the United States with more resources and education than do native-born Black Americans, and particularly descendants of slaves, multi-generational Black Americans. There is a history, and I think civil rights leaders of the time mentioned how Black immigrants who came in their African attire were quickly identified as not being freedmen. They were not multi-generational Americans, and they were treated differently than were native-born Black Americans. And even today, what you see from white anti-racist educators and the like is that they tell on the fact that white folks and those in positions of power generally prefer to hire immigrants over native-born Black Americans and even immigrants themselves of all races, including African immigrants and non and immigrants who are Black, tend to hire their own as well. So I'm curious to know, Michael, your thoughts on how that should be considered. And in addition, prior to the civil rights era, there were a small number of people Black folk who migrated to the United States, and the fact that it was, illegal, so to speak, for Africans to come here until, after, 1970 or so. So how do you justify their inclusion in reparations, given that information and what you cited in your article?
Denise, may I say something real quick? And if it's possible, Denise, Michael, can you please answer my question too? Well, would you ever tell a Jewish person who moved to Germany today that they deserve to get reparations because of the Holocaust, because anti-Semitism is still a problem? I really want you to answer that because that's exactly what you pretty much said in your article, that a Black person can move here because anti-Blacks is still in America, so they deserve reparations that's due to freemen. Would you say that same thing to a Jewish person who moves to Germany, doesn't have any ties to the Holocaust, but because they're Jewish and because anti-Semitism exists, they deserve reparations as well? If you could answer that as well, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. So yeah, I'll answer that real quick. So, well, first of all, I think it's problematic to compare the reparations case to the Holocaust case and the Japanese internment case, because in both uh, cases, it would be argued that America is paying reparations for something it did, and which is my point. So my position has never been that like every Black person in America deserves reparation. Like if you just
That's
Black
what
and you
you said
showed
in
up
your
like two
article,
weeks
though.
ago,
I'm sorry. That's what you
no,
said in your article.
uh, that is not what I said in my article. But my point has always been that when we're talking about the specific case for reparations, and this is something I've written about for years, is that like one of the positions that I hold is that like that it should go back, it should be generational, right? So I don't I agree with Marcel that like if you just showed up in 1970 or in 1980 or 1960, then you might not you should not you're not due reparations or the same reparations as a person who is a descendant of slave. But my point, my ultimate point is that if we're talking about the vestiges of slavery, again, a person who immigrated here in 1918 or in 1937, right? They've suffered the vest, and I'm not arguing that the suffering is equal or that the payment should be equal, but they suffered from the vestiges of slavery and this arbitrary cutoff date, as if there is a pot, and and that we're just going to split this one pot when if we're going to get into the economic data, this black people are the only people who even consider letting America off the hook that way, right? Like if we talk about Social Security, they don't say like, here's how much we're going to spend on Social Security. Now y'all split it up. They don't say that about white farmer aid. They don't say it about Medicaid. They don't say it about Medicare. This is the only argument that point even comes up. They say this is the harm that we've done, or this is the thing that we should pay per person, or this is what these people deserve, and then we'll figure it out from there. And however much that comes to is what we'll pay. And it may send America into debt, as Social Security did, as Medicare did, as Medicaid does, right? And if you're talking about, the Jewish people, and if you want me to answer that question, what I would say is that there were people who were in internment camps that were not Jewish that got reparations, right? Because they are paying for a thing that they did. And when we think of the Holocaust, we specifically attribute it to Jewish people, but all of the reparations that they pay are for a thing that Germany did. All of the reparations that America pays to people who were in internment camps are for a thing that America did. So what we are saying here is, and we know you did this thing to black people, but some of the black people who you did the thing to, that you were doing the exact same thing, not as long, but the exact same thing after they got here and after their children got here and after their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren got here. But they're not descendants of slaves, so we're going to let you off the hook for that when that same sentiment is the same weapon that you use against black people. And to let America off the hook like that is a strategy of division, because you know what, those fourth and fifth generation black immigrants who've been here since the 1930s and the 40s, you know where they live? In same redlined areas that black people live, right? Like the data shows that. The same suffering that a person whose great-great-great-grandfather came here in 1923 suffers is what the grandchild of freedmen. And I'm not saying that every single black person, I would never even argue that. It's like a moot point that every single black person in America should get reparations. But the
But
reparations
Michael, that's
should
what you said.
go
I
to
have it in the jumbotron. That's what
affording,
you said.
the reparations should go to the people who are harmed by the institutions and the discrimination that was leveled against the people who suffered from those vestiges.
Michael, I'd like to
Okay.
address what Marcel was saying for a second here. So, on page 13 of the PDF, anyway, of your article, you say, point number 2 on that page, there are better ways, such as, and then I'm going down about 4 bullets, and you say, just pay everybody black. You say, look, I know what I said about California's law, but you and I both know that this thing is going to end up in court anyway. And then you said you're not talking about, everybody being able to recite a particular lyric, but you did ask for, instead of using lineage, use a metric where the state could use the same individual information to create an algorithm that determines how much wealth was stolen from each participant. And so you did call for the payment of everybody Black. And I don't know if that was more of a just, colloquial sort of thing, or if that was literal for you. And that's the challenge that Marcel is presenting. And then if you can put a pin in that, if you listen to the conversation that was happening during AB 3121, and I mention it because it's the most robust so far, the most robust dialogue about reparations that we've seen publicly, when they had Chair Chemerinsky, a constitutional law scholar, come on and explain this multiple times. They talked about the idea of how using race as the hook would weaken the laws and the plan's ability to withstand constitutional challenge. So when you say pay everybody Black, and when you talk about this metric, how do you envision what you are discussing and what others are discussing in this race-based all people Black perspective? How does that withstand the challenge of what has been laid out from the law? And doesn't it weaken the possibility of reparations for descendants of slaves, the people who have truly borne the burden all of these years and who make up the vast majority of Black America? Doesn't that essentially weaken the effort for them trying to make it so broad that it covers everybody?
May
Well,
I?
so go ahead.
Hey, I want to say, Michael, okay, there's two things you said that are really interesting. You said that we'll be divisive and we'll pretty much have like a hierarchy among ourselves if we have reparations. You didn't use the hierarchy was an exact word, but what you're proposing is just as bad. You're saying if we do what you're saying, do like a tier system, or you've been here this long, you've been here that long, how would that not cause division? That would be even more divisive. That will cause division within a family. My family has been here, like yours, because you're Gullah Geechee, probably since the 1700s, probably since the 1600s. We will not. So what? My mother will get more because she's been here longer. That's the problem with doing this generation thing. No, it doesn't go by generations. Also, Michael, check this out. There were Japanese who were interns that did not get paid reparations by the U.S. because the U.S. said they're not our responsibility. Those people are from Peru. What you're saying is the same thing that the U.S. will say to us if we try to include all Black people, people from Jamaica, people from Cuba. And I also want to bring out a point that we need to say. You keep saying the 30s and 40s. In the census from the 50s, the 60s, and going back, the percentage of Black people who were from other countries was to the right of the decimal. So it was hardly any, probably single digit, maybe double digit. There were hardly any Black immigrants. Even right now, as we speak, 90% of the Black American population are freedmen. We are non-immigrant background. So even now, as we speak, the lineage of most Black people in this country are Black Americans. It's very easy to identify us because we make up the majority. I also want to say in your article, you sort of contradicted yourself. You said that race is something that white people make up. So why would you want to make our claim then based on something that white people make up, knowing that they made it up, they can do whatever they want to do with it? Race might be a social construct that people can argue whether if it's real or not. I tend to feel that social constructs have real impacts on the world because technically a dollar bill only has value because we believe it does. That's a social construct. But to your point, though, if race is something that white people made up and it can be manipulated, let's go with something that can't be manipulated, something that cannot be denied, and that is lineage. It is a fact that chattel slavery happened in this nation for 260 years. Technically, they really found ways to perpetuate it through sharecropping, debtors' prisons, vagrancy laws. It is a fact that there were over 50 Black Wall Streets, prosperous cities and towns that were destroyed by anti-Black mob violence, either burnt to the ground or flooded. It is a fact that the FHA formed in the 1920s to put railroads and highways through Black neighborhoods, and they did that up until the 60s. It is a fact that Black Americans have had 14 million acres of the 15 million we amassed stolen from us. And one of the reasons why it was stolen was through heirs property, which the USDA anti-Black discrimination. These things all took place again between 1776 and 1965 when there were almost no Black immigrants here. How is it that we're here for centuries and a person can move here tomorrow and you say, oh, because America's an anti-Black nation, they need to go ahead and give them a check too? Reparations is not to solve anti-blackness, Michael. Reparations is to pay the debt that this country still has not paid to the same people who were on those plantations at the end of the Civil War during emancipation. The people who built the infrastructure of this nation that, according to studies, still generates trillions from the port of Charleston, which you know is the ninth busiest port in America, to the port of Savannah here, which is the third busiest port. It's for the people who fought. And Abraham Lincoln said, if not for the Negro, this country would have lost the battle. Those were our ancestors. This country owes them. Now, what we look like, I go to you, you owe me $100, and my brother comes along and you say, well, because he's in my family too, I got to give him 100 too. Can't afford it. See you later. That would be the dumbest thing ever. You owe me 100. You don't owe my brother 100. So just because these black immigrants might be black like we are, that doesn't make them entitled to our debt. If you want to solve inequality in America, that is a separate matter. Reparations is not to solve inequality. Reparations is not to make white people like us. I don't care if they do or don't. Reparations is to pay the debt that this nation has yet to pay us from the time we were emancipated. We are their children, not the black immigrants coming here from Cuba or Colombia.
Michael, so there were some questions that were posed before, and feel free to answer that. But I'm curious to know, so there are a couple things that are happening, and I'm curious to know if you see American descendants of slaves or descendants of U.S. slavery as a unique and distinct people is one of the questions that listeners are having right now. Do you see them? Do you see freedmen as a unique and distinct people? Michael, are you muted? Am I in the matrix or is Michael?
We can hear you, Denise.
Okay.
Michael, are you with
I
us?
think
Michael?
I was in the matrix. I was on mute.
Okay.
So yeah, so yes, I do see descendants of enslaved people in America as unique individuals. No question about it. And I think, to answer Marcel's question, I again, all the statistics he rattled off are the same arguments that I make often, right? It, and I do not think that there is a question that most of the reparations are going to go to descendants of slaves because that's who's here in America. What I think this argument is evolved into just is what is the end point? And what I say is that, again, I do not. My position is not that if you, like Marcel said, if you got here yesterday and you're black, you should get reparations. I do not think that is feasible. I don't think that solves the question. My argument has never been like it's to make black people happy or make white people feel good about black people. But if we're talking about all of those cases and the legal strategy, I do think that the law is not moral, right? So when you're talking about the case for reparations, you're talking about, first of all, from 18 until 1865, slavery was legal and constitutional, right? So in a court of law, America, like legally, America did nothing wrong. Like that is the position of almost every legal scholar, right? So what you would have to show is what those effects of slavery were after slavery. And my position is that it weakens the argument just if you limit it to freedom, because again, a judge is going to say, well, it was constitutional, it was legal, and even though I think the general consensus is that it was wrong, right? Legally, what this country did was not against the law. But the Supreme Court has also said, hey, when you took those black people's tax money and gave it to white people, that was wrong. That's what Brown versus Board of Education said. That's what many of the rulings about the systemic institution of white supremacy has said. right? And so those arguments would have to be included in any legal argument because that is the only precedent that we have. If we rely simply on the argument that slavery was wrong, the first argument will be from the opposition is that, oh, well, technically it was legal. And then the second argument would be, and those people were not American citizens,
Great.
right?
So let me,
Yeah, I
yes.
can
So
read
let
this
me
one.
read, hold on for a second, Marcel. Let me read some of the information from AB 3121 so we can get clear on how it is connecting slavery and its lingering effects to your point, Michael. So let me read this. So it says that the institution of slavery is inextricably woven into the establishment, history, and prosperity of the United States, constitutionally and statutorily sanctioned from 1619 to 1865. Slavery deprived more than 4 million Africans and their descendants of life, liberty, citizenship, cultural heritage, and economic opportunity. Following the abolition of slavery, government entities at the federal, state, and local levels continue to perpetuate, condone, and often profit from practices that brutalized African Americans and excluded them from meaningful participation in society. This legacy of slavery and racial discrimination has resulted in debilitating economic, educational, and health hardships that are uniquely experienced by African Americans. The AB 3121 charges the Reparations Task Force with studying the institution of slavery and its lingering negative effects on living African Americans, including descendants of persons enslaved in the United States and on society. So, what this bill has been looking at is the lingering effect of slavery on the people, the descendants of the people who survived or experienced chattel slavery, specifically for reasons similar to what Marcel had said, which is the idea that the vast majority of African Americans were actually the descendants of slaves before the 1970s. And were you to include all Black people in it, it would become a race based and constitutionally weak, open to significant challenge just on its face if race were the leading factor there versus lineage there. Marcel?
So thank you, Denise. What you just read, I'm going to repeat this point. I'm going to double, triple, quadruple down on it. Reparations is not more of Black Americans come out and save democracy, save America. Reparations is us finally saving ourselves. Something we should have done a long time ago, and we've really been trying to do. It's exclusive to us because the debt is owed to us. Now, I want to say something, though, real quick, Michael. You said that slavery will be weak grounds because it was constitutional. That is not true. That is a big myth. It was something I even believed once. Probably I never even questioned whether it was constitutional. So I can't even say I believed it. I just never questioned it. Slavery actually was never federally constitutionalized ever. That is the reason why our state, you and I are both South Carolinians here. We know South Carolina is the birthplace of the Confederacy. That is why when South Carolina seceded, what was the first thing the Confederates did? They wrote their own constitution. And why did they write their own constitution? Because they felt the Constitution of the U.S. was going to be used against them by who? Abraham Lincoln, who was a constitutional lawyer. And why were they afraid of Abraham Lincoln? Because he was of the constitutional lawyers who realized that the Constitution was actually to be used to prove that slavery should not be allowed in the United States of America. So what did they include in the Constitution of the Confederacy? They explicitly put in there words that you do not find in the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution doesn't say a thing about race. It doesn't say slavery. It doesn't say Negro. It doesn't say slave trade. It says nothing like that at all. The Confederacy put in their Constitution Negro slavery, slave trade. They made it specific. So the Constitution, this argument that slavery was constitutional is a lie. Another thing, saying that they weren't citizens, that's the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision, people have this attitude the Supreme Court cannot be wrong. Yet, there are several ways, and even now, I think last week, an article came out Supreme Courts can be what they call out of good practice. Out of good practice, meaning that they cite precedent or they ignore precedent. The Dred Scott decision was a wrong decision. Here's how it was. That's the finding. They said that a Negro is not a citizen, but they contradicted themselves already. How? Because if a Negro was not a citizen, then how in the hell was a Negro able to take his case to the Supreme Court? How in the hell was a Negro who's not a citizen able to go through several courts and get to the Supreme Court? A person who's not a citizen cannot do that. The fact that Dred Scott was able to even petition the courts as a citizen shows he was already a citizen. The fact that slavery did not even exist in a lot of the states at that time shows that it was never constitutional. The fact that northern states ignored the Fugitive Slave Act, saying that slavery cannot be forced upon them because it was not something that the federal government enshrined, shows that this argument of slavery being constitutional is not something that with all legal scholars agree. And the truth be told, the evidence shows that it was not. And again, Michael, let's say even if slavery was constitutional, let me humor you some because I hear people say that the Japanese internment was legal. That was actually a law. You can literally take a Japanese person and put him in concentration camps. That was a law. And yet the Japanese got reparations for something that when it happened was legal to be done. So even if slavery was constitutional and legal at the time, that still does not take away from our reparations claim because the Japanese internment was legal. Technically, Hitler put in the Jews in concentration camps. He was in control of Germany at the time. That could be argued to have been legal. But the fact of the matter is, even if slavery was constitutional, which it was not, that will not take away from our reparations claim. And that will still be the place where our debt starts. It starts with chattel slavery. So if your ancestor wasn't up in there when chattel slavery was happening, you're not going to just get off a plane and say, hey, give me my check because I'm black. Because if you can't tell a Jewish person who survived the Holocaust that a Jewish person from Ethiopia, for example, moves to Israel, and you can't say to that Jewish person anti-Semitism is a big problem, so give all Jewish people a check. No one would dare say that to Holocaust survivors. Ain't no one gonna say that to us who've been surviving the American Holocaust and still fighting its legacy.
Michael, do you have a rebuttal to that? And then we'll move forward with additional questions.
Yeah. First, I want to say that, first of all, slavery is in the Constitution. The Constitution includes an end date for the slave trade. And, most constitutional decisions and Supreme Court decisions are based on implications in the Constitution, right? So, and then, this is an arcane point, but there is a difference between legal and constitutional. Segregation was legal, and because anybody could pass a law, we could pass, a legislature could get together and say, we're going to pass a law now that, only white people can have water, right? And that is exactly what the Supreme Court is for, because if they pass that law, only white people getting water will be legal, and the Supreme Court would have to deem it unconstitutional, right? So the Constitution includes slavery. It has an implication of slavery. The fugitive slave law went to the Supreme Court many times and was upheld. There are numerous freedom cases in that appeared in the Supreme Court where people were, for instance, Penny Lane was in the Missouri Territory and taken, where slavery wasn't legal, and she petitioned the court then. And the implication from that is that if you are in the boundaries of the United States, slavery is constitutional. So the idea that slavery is in the Constitution is a myth, right? The words might not be in there, just like the words, like you got the right to have a gun ain't in there, but we infer what arms mean, right? That's the basis of many constitutional arguments on both sides, right?
Okay.
But the larger point of this, and I don't know why, it might be a point that, it's like your bullet point or whatever, but the idea that you could just get off a plane and get reparations because you're black has is not a position that any person really holds. I don't know why you're arguing that. So, but I do
Okay,
think
Michael, hold on.
that hold on,
Oh,
let me finish. That the larger point of it is that if we decide, like, I am for reparations regardless, but if we decide to limit reparations to freedmen and exclude people who are the descendants of people who suffered from the effects of slavery. Like, I'm not arguing that it is about discrimination or racism or white supremacy. I'm talking about people who came to this country, whether you're talking about the people who came from the Louisiana territories, the hundreds of thousands of people of color, free people of color, and black people who came to the Louisiana territories and were not enslaved and were never descendants of slaves and were suffered the same discrimination. I'm talking about the people who came to this country after emancipation. And I'm not talking about everybody black, but I'm talking about the people who suffered from the vestiges of slavery are not limited to freedmen, although I do agree with you that there is and should be a special consideration for the descendants of slaves. There is no question that they have suffered disproportionately from the vestiges of slavery and from slavery, right? But if you are going to even include the bill makes the point, right? Because when it talks about the vestiges of slavery, if you read the bill, notice when it talks about the vestiges of slavery, it just switches all of a sudden from descendants of enslaved to African Americans, because it is a fact that all of those discriminatory laws, all of those constitutionally upheld discriminatory laws, all of the segregation, all of the Jim Crow, all of the things that the American military did to veterans, all of that affected more people than just there is no doubt about that, than just the descendants of slaves. There is even no doubt about it. So, if you want to make the argument that reparations should be limited only to the descendants of slaves, you are making the choice to live and leave out hundreds of thousands and maybe millions of people who suffered that same effect of what America does to black people and what America did to the descendants of slaves, because they're not included in the category that you deem appropriate for reparations.
I'm going to ask a question here, Michael, and thank you for sharing that. And a couple things I want to know. A, we have more questions here, and there's lots of conversation that people want to have around this. I am also wanting to mark time. It is 8:45 Central. We said this would be an hour to an hour and a half conversation. I want to check time and availability for you two. Do we need to hard stop at 9, or can we go to 9:30?
It's 9:46, right?
I'm in Central Time, so
Oh,
yeah. So do we have another 45 minutes, or do we need to hard stop in 13 minutes? Let me know, because
I'm
y'all are the
good.
show. Okay,
I'm good.
Michael, what about you? Michael, what about you?
I'm overtime already, but I am
Hey,
enjoying the conversation. So,
but I
like,
need
I'll
to
go as
Okay.
long as I
can I
can. But
respond to what Michael said then if he has to go? So
I
yeah,
didn't hear what he said, if he does have to go or not, Marcel. Hold on a second.
he
Michael,
said
what
he's
did you say?
I said I'm overtime already, but I'll go as long as possible because I am enjoying the conversation.
Okay, so let's reset and
This
let's
is
plan
yeah.
on
Go ahead.
wrapping up. Let's plan on wrapping up at the half hour after. So that would be 9:30 my time, 10:30 Eastern. So Marcel, if you could respond to him, that would be great, and then we're going to move forward with some additional questions.
right. So, Mike, I want to say it would be strange then, from your view, that slavery was constitutional and the Constitution enabled it, even though, like you said, slave is never mentioned. the Constitution is race neutral, and a lot of abolitionists use the Constitution to argue against slavery. And that's why, again, the Confederacy wrote their own. They did not just say, let's get the U.S. Constitution, but let's call it something different. They wrote their own. They put the word
Well,
slavery in. Hold on,
I think I
hold on,
just want to make the point
hold
that
on real
the
quick. It
hold
would
on,
be
just
crazy,
one
though.
point
Okay.
that the reason the Confederacy wrote a constitution is because it was a new country and countries have constitutions.
Right,
I mean, I
but they
think we all
changed their
agree
link. But
that that
oh,
the
okay, yeah. But
Confederacy
let's
made
hold
If
conservative
on.
you
slavery.
guys could wait for each other to finish speaking, I think people will be able to hear your very valid points, and it would just make it a different experience.
The Confederacy's Constitution is very similar to the U.S. Constitution, but there's a glaring difference. They explicitly add slavery. They explicitly add race to it, inferiority of the Negro, something the U.S. Constitution did not do. And since I know you're not a historian, but I know you know this. When the original U.S. Constitution was being written, you know that there were slave enslavers who wanted to add race to it, Negro, who wanted to add the word slavery and were unhappy and almost didn't ratify it when they did. And as far as us not being citizens, another point with that is BS, because at the time the Dred Scott decision was made, Black Americans were voting in several states. So how can a decision come along and say we're not citizens when Black people were literally voting? So again, this thing that slavery was constitutional is not factual like people try to make it. It wasn't. But I also want to go here and say this to you too. I want to ask you again, when the Japanese were interned, there was a lot of yellow panic. They call it yellow hysteria sometimes going on, where pretty much people of Asian descent, they were getting just a little bit of what Black American freedmen have been going through for centuries. There was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment at that time. Obviously so high, it led to a law being passed that could throw Japanese in internment camps. You know as well as I do, because the documentation is out there, that there were people who were not interned of Japanese descent, some who were Asian but not of Japanese descent, that went through horrific levels of anti-Asian sentiment. Those people did not get a dime for Japanese internment. Now, you still have people around who are descendants of those who were interned in internment camps, and some who are descendants of those who receive the payments. Would you dare tell them that they are being selfish for leaving out the Filipinos, for leaving out the Koreans, for leaving out the Chinese, for leaving out the people from Laos? Would you say that to them? No. Would you dare tell someone who is Cherokee and a person who's Apache comes and they want to come on the reservations of the Cherokee, get some of the funding that's for the Cherokee, and the Cherokee say no? Would you then tell the Cherokee they are being selfish? They're leaving out other Native Americans? No, because if you would have, you would have done it already. And again, I'm going right back to my analogy with the Jews, the Holocaust survivors. Would you tell them collecting a check that they are selfish because there are other people of Jewish descent that do not get a check because they are not Holocaust survivors? No. So why is it okay that people think they have the right to tell free men that we have to be all inclusive when that energy is never shown to us? Y'all's president, this current segregationist we have in the White House, Joe Crow, Joe Biden, whatever y'all call the man, he just made a statement saying that he will only consider, which I'm not even going to get on that because it makes me too angry. He would consider reparations for Black Americans if Native Americans are included. This is the same man who has now devoted historic level of funding to Native Americans. Where are we in the historic levels of funding? Where are we with the tax exemption status Native Americans have? Where are we with the casino revenue that Native Americans have? Where are we with the direct payments that some of them get? Japanese Americans are one of the wealthiest demographics in the United States of America. You can believe if they had not received reparations, they would not be. Israel is a country that gets probably more aid and support from the United States than almost any other nation. And it's a pretty wealthy country because they had investment from the UK and from the United States of America. And Jewish people in this country, by and large, are very wealthy. Of course, Ukraine right now is going through what they call an invasion. And they are not saying any European who's having a hard time, we're going to bring you over to America and give you refuge. They are specifically doing it for Ukrainians. Specificity exists in every single action this country takes. The only time people get their panties in a damn bunch is when finally free men are saying, hey, What about us? We deserve specific redress for our specific history. There is no other group in this country, in this world, that toiled underneath the American government, building the infrastructure, and then after slavery was ended, went through levels of anti-black terrorism, government sanction. Until this day, have not seen a penny. I would encourage you, Michael, if you want to criticize someone, criticize the Germans. You know why? Because Germany is paying Holocaust to Jews, but they ain't paying Holocaust to the black Namibians that they threw up in concentration camps, and they had a death rate that would have been almost as high as the Jews if not for other conflict that took place. How about go after it with Native Americans who are discriminating against Black Americans who have Native American ancestry. Right now, as we speak, and I already know you know this, there are Black people who have Native American ancestry who are not being allowed to enjoy their benefits. Write an article about that, but don't write an article telling freedmen that we don't have a right. First of all, you did make one point in your article in which I agree with. You did say, why are we having to solve the crime? Like, why are we having to fix the problem? That's the history of America. But the point of the matter is, that's what it's always been. We've always saved this nation, and this nation, nor have any of these other groups that you want us to vouch for, including Black immigrants by and large, have never shown up to save us. The fact of the matter is, this reparations movement is being led by freemen, the children of the people enslaved, just as you are. No one has the right to tell us whom we need to include, especially when those people are not a part of the debt and are not the descendants of the people that this nation was supposed to make whole at the end of the Civil War and failed to do it. This debt still exists, and the debt has grown larger.
I'm going to thank you, Marcel. I'm going to pose the next question here. There's so much we can address, but so, Michael, in your 10-point critique about lineage-based reparations, you say it is based on white history, it is white math, it is racist. Can you clarify for us that charge, and then we'll allow Marcel an opportunity to respond?
Yeah, sure. So I think the answer to like what I was talking about is that the people who would love to limit like what they did, like we just did slavery and then we ended it, is white people, right? And not all the stuff that they did afterwards, right? Not the GI Bill, right? Because all of the Black people who fought in the First World War and the Second World War who wasn't afforded the GI Bill that was promised to them, right? That was legally promised to them, they would be excluded, right? If they are not a descendant of slaves. And again, that's an important point because one of the ways that you could speed up or even get American citizenship if you were an immigrant was to fight for this country. And Black people fought disproportionately in World War One and World War Two, and Black immigrants fought more disproportionately in World War One and World War Two than white immigrants and Asian immigrants. And to answer Marcel's point about the survivors of the Holocaust, we like to think of them as like they paid the survivors of the Holocaust, so they paid the Jews, but there were people who are not Jewish who were in the Holocaust and got reparations because the Germany paid for what they did to people, right? So most of those people were Jews, and some of them were not. If you're talking about the internment camps, most of the people interned in the internment camps were Japanese Americans, but there were some Chinese Americans. There were some Asian Americans from other companies that were in those internment camps who got reparations because America paid for what it did. Now, when you're talking about Black people or the descendants of slaves, again, no one argues that you can get off the plane in 1992 and you should get reparations. But what America did to Black people in America, and we agree that the vast majority of those people were the descendants of slaves. but it was not limited. White people do not care about no distinction between a second generation or a third generation person from Jamaica and a second or third generation descendant of slaves, right? Like the disparities that we're talking about, they are present when you show up here. Those grandchildren are black to white people. Those grandchildren were black according to the laws, according to the segregation laws, according to Jim Crow, according to the way schools were constructed, according to the way the neighborhoods were redlined. It was just black people, right?
Gotcha.
And
Michael, can I
the
Hold
ask
on.
only
you
thing that
can I ask you a question just to flesh that out a little bit? Marcel, I see you. I know you have a response to that. But I'm curious about, you named, for example, the immigrants who fought and they were using service in the military as a way to get citizenship. Do you see that as a separate claim from slavery reparations? Michael, you're muted again, I think.
yeah, I'm sorry, I was muted again. Yeah, I think that if we're talking about the vestiges of slavery, right? So the reason they were denied was not because they were immigrants, but because they were black. And, and because of the vestiges of slavery. The reason people were redlined was not because they were immigrants, even if they were black immigrants who were redlined. The reason they couldn't go to school with Asians and Jews and Irish people was not because they were immigrants, right? It was because of the specific vestiges of slavery. And so, in my, in my opinion, and my position has always been that although it should not be the same, like all the black people shouldn't get the same, but the people who the legacy of slavery extends, if we're talking about what America did and what America should pay for, it extends past just the descendants of slaves. It extends to the people who America's policy looked at and said, you ain't no different from a debtor descendant of slaves. Not just because of your lineage, but because of the color of your skin. And there's really no argument about that. The law said it. Like, it ain't no thing that we're like making up nuanced points about. This is what the law said, right? The law did not discriminate on people based on their lineage. The banks did not discriminate on credit because of your lineage. The schools did not give you an unequal education because of your lineage. But all of a sudden, we're going to say, nah, just these people. Now, I do agree, again, that there are people who have suffered disproportionately and the reparations should affect that. But it ain't our duty to let America off the hook if we're talking about reparations for, and the laws, every bill that you spoke about in the beginning specifically addressed the vestiges of slavery. And those are the specific vestiges of slavery, suffered disproportionately by freedmen and their descendants, but not exclusively.
Marcel?
So you actually made my point for me, actually. So you said that they didn't discriminate against us because of our lineage. But the fact is, they discriminated against us, and that is a part of our lineage. Lineage happens because we have a shared group of experiences, we have a shared history. A person who comes here from Jamaica, for example, I can't go to Jamaica and they are now saying to the British Parliament, y'all owe us. And I say, well, look, I went through slavery as well. You owe me. No, because my lineage is not the same as a person from Jamaica. Doesn't matter if I stay there. Doesn't matter if I live there and have children there and have grandchildren there. My lineage will still be one of a person who was enslaved by the American government, a freedman. Okay, again, I'm gonna repeat this. You keep talking about how black immigrants in the GI Bill. Most people at the time the GI Bill were done were black Americans. The population of black immigrants really started to happen after 1965, but it's really taken off since the 2000s. So again, before 1965, there were virtually almost a single digit, probably, black immigrants in this nation. And you keep talking about how a black person can get off the plane and white people see them as black. You talk about white supremacists and talking points. Actually, the white supremacist talking point is what you do when you say that black people are all the same, that we don't have a unique culture. If you see me as a black American and say that a person who's Afro Brazilian, we're all just the same, that is actually depriving us more of our unique identity. Something that white people, anti black white people, do when they say, oh, we're all just Negroes, we're all the same, we all act alike, think alike, look alike. No, it is actually respectful. It's actually something that's great to honor the fact that we have differences culturally and we definitely have differences in regards to lineage. Letting America off the hook will be what you want to do, saying, "Oh, just stop being racist to black people." Again, Michael, reparations is not to stop anti-blackness. Reparations is for there's always going to be people who are anti-black in this nation. They can go to hell for all I care. Reparations is to make this nation pay the debt that they were supposed to pay to us at the end of 1865. You still have yet to address how is it fair that a person who chose to move here, knowing America's history, all of a sudden wants to say to America, pay me because I was harmed by you being anti black. They didn't have to move here. You see, there's an option that black immigrants have that black Americans don't. They can move back to their home nation. This is our home nation. This is the nation where if you go to Charleston, Savannah, you see fingerprints, as you know, in the cities and in the streets. Are those fingerprints from people who got off the airplane and were harmed by America? No, those fingerprints are the fingerprints of our great, 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 great grandparents, the people that this country was supposed to give the 40 acres in the mule, the people that this country, for a short while, gave a department of the branch to make sure that they were well fed, had good health care, well paying jobs, land and housing, the Freedmen's Bureau, the people this country was supposed to help build generational wealth by means of the Freedmen's Bank. That was not to black immigrants. That was to us. How is it that you want us to now say, oh, just help everyone black? No, we have a specific claim that's for us. Let me explain something. You're black, I'm black. Let's say you came here from Barbados. If I have an ice cream and the United States of America slaps it out my hand, and I say, hey, that's my ice cream. Then let's say they give both of us an ice cream and then they give both of us two ice creams. They still owe me for that goddamn ice cream that they slapped out my hand. In other words, trying to do all a rising tide lifts all boats policies, something that we have been sold for the longest that has not worked. If it ain't worked when they've done it for all Americans, what makes you think it's going to work if they do it for black Americans, which they tried to do already with this farming bill that they tried to do for all black farmers and farmers of color, and now it's being held up in court. Whereas with the Pigment Glickman Act, they did it for black farmers who were of the same lineage and had a specific experience of being discriminated against by the USDA because they were black Americans. Though that case went through, that case won. If it's one thing I'm not a lawyer, but it's one thing I know about the legal department, it is precedent. And precedent shows that lineage wins, race base will lose. And it's not just here from a legal standpoint, it's from a logical standpoint. Once again, if your ancestor was not on those plantations when this country was supposed to give us our 40 acres and a mule, build generational wealth, and have the Freedmen's Bureau give us full equity, then how in the world can you come here and jump in on a claim being led by the people who are the descendants of those ancestors and say you should be a part of it too? Especially when black people from these countries, like the Caribbean, CARICOM is doing a reparations claim. And guess what? I've read it. They don't say a thing about black Americans. A matter of fact, CARICOM doesn't even include the entire Caribbean. They only include the specific countries that are part of CARICOM. Where's your think piece about them? Right now, the Democratic Republic of Congo, they are telling Belgium that they need to pay them. And when that happened, Rwanda said, well, what about us? So guess what Rwanda did? Did they say to the Democratic Republic of Congo, well, make us a part of it? No. Rwanda is now filing their separate claim. If there is a person in this nation who's not a freeman, but they feel they have been hurt because of being black, no one is stopping them from taking up their own case and taking it to the federal government. But what we ain't going to do is what we have done for too damn long, is make freemen the muse of everyone else. We do the work. Everyone else gets the benefits. That is going to stop. So if anyone feels they have a separate case, take it up with the government. But the reparations case is for freemen specifically.
So I want to transition after that is a good point to transition to another one of the critiques in Michael's 10 reasons, and also I think a general element of the conversation about reparations in general. So we know that there are many people who have lived past as white, and for quite some time, their family may have had a black or mulatto ancestor, but they've been living as white now, and or there are people who live currently and pass as white, right? But they can claim to be African American because they have some recent ancestry. So the question is this: should and will white people get reparations? And does that, what's the word, speak against lineage? Does that speak against or for the race-based argument? Does it protect lineage-based reparations? What are your thoughts on that, Michael? And then we'll go to you, Marcel.
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that again there are, you know, uh, when I talk about, and it actually, it's funny that Marcel made the point that I used to make in like on the first day of my classes, that money is also a social construct, as is race, and that is, and it goes to the point that like white people will will have, and it is possible that there will be as many or more white people who have a claim, if it is specifically tied to lineage, to reparations, because there are, it's not just, you know, white people who, black people who are passing, there's white people who have lived for generations as white people, like literally if all the people who, you know, instigated the case Plessy versus Ferguson, which, you know, the Supreme Court later overturned, to Marcel's point about Supreme Court can make wrong decisions, but there are millions of white people who, if they don't know, they'll find out. Like we know, like white America is great at finding loopholes. So it, because of that, any reparations based argument that specifies lineage must also specify race, which is kind of the thing that makes it all, like, you know, nonsensical, right? Like you got to include race in there, or white people gonna get all of it too. And if you're worried about black people who, again, suffered from the vestiges of slavery but were not freedmen getting money, but not the white people who are getting money, who unquestionably are more, or a larger group than the black immigrants who were in America before a certain date. I don't understand the logic of that argument because, again, unless you include race in reparations, white people are going to be at the front of the line. We know this. This is how America works. And it is a simple, logical fact.
Marcel?
Okay, I'm I'm reading your article. I was just looking at it, and then Denise called me. What I didn't know, but you mentioned something about how a white person did a DNA test and found out they had African ancestry, and you make the point that race is a social construct, something that white people made up. So if that's the case, then race is a social construct, and is only what we really believe or accept it to be. Then what is it that we do what you are wanting, race-based reparations? What is to stop a white person who's 2% black from showing up and saying, well, I'm black because I have black in me? That is the danger of having race based reparations. Your proposal would actually make race based reparations give more money to white people who are probably participating in the enslavement of Black Americans, the terrorism of Black Americans. Lineage based reparations is a much tighter way because you have to be able to prove that you are the descendant of a person who was enslaved, redlining, Jim Crow, land theft. The theft of the Freedmen's Bank. And not only do you have to prove it, I'm not talking about what happened in California, but the general consensus is you have to be a descendant of a person who was enslaved, but you also have to classify yourself as black consistently on all records for a decade or more. So there are different benchmarks and parameters with lineage to make sure that people just can't slither their way into our claims. But race based, we will see what we've been seeing, where you have that guy, that cop, who was about to get fired for being racially discriminatory, and then he said, "Well, look at me, I'm black. I'm 12% black." That is what happens when you leave things open to race space. People take DNA tests, then all of a sudden we got $5 freemen popping up. Lineage, you have to be able to prove that this has been the experience of your family. You can change and manipulate race. You cannot change and manipulate lineage. And as with all types of initiatives, there's going to be parameters in place. I've read the text of the California task force. They are going to develop ways to make sure that exactly what you mentioned does not happen. Because with any type of initiative, even with the Japanese, even with the claims collection that handles reparations for Jewish people, there are always going to be people who come and try to scam. Scam artists exist. But when we do it for race based, they don't need the scam. All somebody got to do is come up and say, "Oh, look at me." In my case, for example, thank goodness I'm 95%, 96% black, but I have like 2% or 3% white or something like that. I can show up and say, "Well, I'm white. Look at my DNA test," and get whatever they get if that was the qualifications. That's what race based does. It is a race to the bottom. Lineage based, a person has to prove it, and they can't just slither their way in there.
Hey, thank you, Marcel. Denise, I'm going to ask this question from the audience really quickly. And Michael, it is for you specifically around the conversations about the Japanese internment. The question is, the Peruvian Japanese people that were interned in the United States did not receive reparations from the United States. What does that say in your argument about specificity when it comes to the descendants of freedmen?
So the people who didn't receive reparations, including the Peruvians, were they didn't receive them because the reparations were paid to the citizens, right? And that's been a ongoing argument in the Supreme Court for years. Is that does the Constitution apply to people who are not citizens? And as far as the idea of like, so if Marcel is saying, well, you also have to prove if you prove your lineage, in the larger reparations conversation, if you also have to prove that you identified as black, then lineage-based reparations also include a racial component. Now, again, race-based reparations, you know, although it is the title of this argument, it is not the title of my position. It is that, like, my position has always been freedmen
Michael, you
and the
said
people who
race
are
based.
exempt. What's that?
Michael, you were arguing for race based reparations in your article. You said lineage
My
based was stupid.
my argument is, and it has always been that freedmen and the people who are affected by the vestiges of slavery, right? And I think it extends past the that exclusive group of freedmen, right? And it doesn't negate any of the arguments that includes freedmen. But if we're going to go lineage plus something, we're going to have to we admit that we're going to have to include some kind of racial aspect in it, right? Because even to Marcel's point, right, if you specify lineage, there are white people who lived for generations as white people and know that they have black and enslaved ancestors, millions of white people, right? And if we're talking, even when we're talking about immigrants, right? When we're talking about immigrants and the exponential growth of just populations in general, right? We're talking about a group that is small in the 1910s or 1920s. You know, we don't know how much that numbers, but we know one thing: it ain't as many as the number of white people who have a specific lineage claim to reparations, who either it is hidden or just as we would have to find out, believe me, they're going to be trying to find out too.
So, Michael, hold on. But to Alexis' point, I want to also bring up with Japanese reparations, they did not just pay Japanese Americans. They actually did pay people who were still citizens of Japan. But guess what? If a person fled and went to Japan during the internment, they were ineligible. The Peruvian Japanese people didn't get a dime. They went through the same type of anti Japanese oppression that the Japanese Americans in internment camps went through, but they did not get a dime. And why? Because they did not meet the criteria. You keep conflating reparations with fixing racism in the United States of America. That ain't what this is about. That ain't the freedmen's job to solve racism in America. That's white people's job, okay? Who have most of the power in the institution. Our push for initiative is to get the debt that was owed to our ancestors. The same way I have heirs property in my family, I'm sure you probably do too, because you're from Johns Island or James Island, not far from me, almost 45, 46 minutes. We inherited the property. We have to pay the taxes on that property, right? If my father dies, that's going to then fall to my siblings and I. And this is coastal front property. It's worth a lot of money. The same way we have inherited that property and we have to pay the taxes on it, America has inherited the debt. But from where did the debt begin? You have to trace the dotted lines back to where it began. It did not begin on someone on U.S. Airlines coming over to live in America, choosing to come to this country that they know is anti-black. It began at the end of the Civil War with emancipation. Those 4 million people that were emancipated. That's when the debt began. And to your point, though, we actually have extended the reparations claim past those who are freemen, because free blacks who were alive at that time, they will be included too. I have my own reparations plan on my website. They will be included just like they're included in the California Task Force Plan. And why? Because those quote unquote free blacks were never truly free. At any time, they could be sold into slavery. They lived under the fair chattel slavery, and a lot of them had relatives who went through chattel slavery. So just because of that fact alone, that they were here prior to emancipation and here after emancipation when it was ended, they do qualify. But extending this to another group because you feel that somehow a person should be paid for being a victim of racism, if a person feels they are a victim of racism from a company or a governmental institution, there is nothing stopping that person from getting a lawyer and taking it to the court case. But reparations, that is the freedmen's debt. You're trying to conflate two different things. If I come here and I move here from Trinidad and Tobago and I'm working at a job and I'm treated differently because I'm black, what do I need to do? Call a lawyer up and take it to the courtroom. However, what I can't do is go to the Congress and say, hey, y'all owe me a debt because you enslaved my ancestor. And at the end of the Civil War, they're supposed to get their 40 acres and a mule. And you were supposed to reconstruct this nation with all of us having equity. And it never happened. They would look at me like I'm a fool. And you would be a fool because everyone knows that reparations is lineage based. It's based upon the people who are descendants of those that were emancipated. It was never based on race. And yes, freedmen are black people. No one's denying that we were treated differently because we are black. But what we are saying, the black people that were there going through hell from the chattel slavery to the lynch mobs to the rapes to the Black Wall Streets being burnt down, the FHA to redlining to Jim Crow, Those black people were freemen. Those were not black immigrants who are now just recently arriving in our nation, 1965, and really taking off in the 2000s. That is the point that I want you to understand. Solving racial inequality in America is not the job of reparations. Solving poverty in America is not the job of reparations. Reparations is the debt that this country owes to freemen that they were supposed to have paid in 1865. They have not, and I'll be damned. And a lot of people like me to be damned if we let them forget that they owe us and us exclusively.
Go ahead, Alexis.
Okay.
I just want to mark time as well. It is about 7 minutes until the half hour, and we're going to plan to wrap up shortly thereafter. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Denise. Michael, we have another question from the audience, and I'm reading this, and I don't have my glasses on. So it says, we're talking about non-descendants of slaves being subject to the same level of racism as the descendants of slaves when the studies show specifically the studies show specifically in the 2015 Pew Research that the Black immigrant population as late as 1980 was only 3.1%. So, who are the mass of people that would have been subject to the racism that are not descendants of the American freedmen? That is the question.
Thanks. That's actually a good question, but and so what we have to recognize is that what those Pew Research is first, and sometimes Pew will go as far as the second generation, right? So when Pew, the next one that comes out, that one doesn't count immigrants. They're not counting immigrants who came here in 1990, right? They're talking about first, and sometimes they'll do specific ones on second generation um, immigrants uh, of all races or ethnicities. So when we're talking about the 2 to 3% that came here, for instance, and so there's a couple of things, right? So there was an influx, between 1900 and the right after the Second World War. Just as the first Great Migration started to happen of immigrants, right? A lot of the people we read about in Black history were the children of immigrants or the children of two immigrants, or Malcolm X, who was born in 1929, right? His mom was an immigrant, right? And a lot of the people who, especially if you're talking about major urban areas, Chicago, New York, especially on the East Coast, we're talking about uh, what was then a small population, but the population grows exponentially, right? So you're talking about, and it's sad that the government and the Census Bureau doesn't do like Pew doesn't go past first one or two generations, right? But I want to address something Marcel said about you know his claim that I think like reparations will fix racism or reparations are about racism. No, my specific position was that reparations are about the economic vestiges of slavery, right? Not just racism, not just because white people were upset with you or you got discriminated against at the job. I'm talking about the economic vestiges of slavery. I'm talking about redlining. I'm talking about the immigrants who enlisted into the U.S. military. Again, I'm talking about the people who were redlined into the same neighborhoods that freedmen's great grandchildren or grandchildren lived in and couldn't attend the schools that their tax dollars paid for. Now, to us, right, or to any population, right, those are two different populations. And when I say that white people don't care, I don't mean that black people don't care. That's why I say that white people don't care. That black people and immigrants are different, but the laws that affect them didn't care either, right? So legally, what I'm talking about, the economic redlining, the the segregation, all of the Jim Crow laws, the underfunding of those schools were the vestiges of slavery and not just exclusive to one group. And again, that population that kind of bubbled in from like the 19 early 1900s until about the 1930s of immigrants, of black immigrants, Caribbean immigrants specifically, right? Like that's how New York went from a majority white city to a city of Caribbean people. That's why Brooklyn had, Caribbean music playing in the 1960s and 50s
How?
because there was that influx of immigrants and that population has grown, right? And that population has suffered from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s who came here. That population has suffered from the vestiges of slavery. Now, I agree with Marcel that it is not the vast majority of freedmen. I agree that they shouldn't get the same money that the vast majority of freedmen get, right? But I do not agree that the government doesn't owe them. Now, if the conversation is this is what we're talking about, the reparations, we're only talking about the reparations for slavery and the wages and the theft from slavery, then I agree with that too, right? Like it should be to the people whose descendants were enslaved. But if we're talking about the reparations for the economic injustices due to the vestiges of slavery, then we cannot. And white people would love us to ignore
Michael.
the what they the product of what they did and the people it affected. And I do not have some kind of thing that this is not my argument is not based on some kind of finite pot of money and that they're gonna get some of my money. That is, and my point has always been that that is the money that is due to people who paid it.
Michael, okay, hold on real quick. So you do realize that reparations, I see, I don't think you're really getting this part. Reparations is not a payment for racism. It is a payment for government sanctioned anti blackness. Government sanctioned anti blackness. We know that we still have a lot of anti black people in the government. We know that black Americans, freedmen, are still to the bottom. If you look at the data, the children of immigrants, because they're a much smaller group, black immigrants, are usually doing much better than freedmen. But that be that as it may, the point of the matter is 1965 marked the end, made it unconstitutional, made it illegal to have legislation that was anti-black. But what it did not do, and what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was about to do, was say that we was coming to get our check. He said it didn't cost America a penny to desegregate lunch counters. It didn't cost them a penny to desegregate movie theaters. But he talked about how much America owed the people, the black Americans, freedmen, who were not given a penny but were going through terrorism, while America, speaking of immigrants, was spending big money on immigrants from Europe. So, Michael, it's not about racism or the vestiges you keep saying of economic harm. It's about the government sanctioned anti blackness that happened from 1776 to 1965. The reason we're still dealing with those vestiges is because we did not get reparations. Okay? And also, you keep talking about immigrants in the 30s and the 40s. Again, in the census, the number of immigrants in the United States of America was to the right of the decimal. That's what all researchers said. I'm looking at the Smithsonian right now that talks about black immigrants, and they say it was almost non-existent. We keep trying to ignore that fact. There were hardly no black immigrants here. Still, by and large, black America is still majority freemen. Also, let me ask you a question. Would you move you and your family to Ukraine right now? Hmm? Right now, we got Joe Crow, the segregationist in chief, who worked with Strom Thurmond, a notorious anti-black segregationist because he wanted to keep black kids out of school. I just had to plug that in there. Not sorry. Anyway, we got Joe Crow in office right now saying that he wants to bring over and expedite 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States of America. Now, we know Ukraine is at war with Russia. If you move you and your family over there, and by the way, speaking of Ukraine, there's a memo out from the Peace Corps saying that Ukrainians are likely to call black people the N word, call them monkey, to be anti black. So it's no wonder America wants submitting them over here. Now, if you move your family over to Ukraine, Michael, and a bomb falls on a missile, lands on your home with your family, or you going out walking in the park and you step on a landmine, or a Ukrainian calls you the N word or a monkey, are you going to then go to the Ukrainian government and say, hey, y'all owe me for the damages? No, you knew what was going on before you went over there. You knew it was a war. Likewise, Black Americans, freemen, we were captive and forced here. We built this nation. We went through government sanctioned anti blackness from 1776 to 1965. This is our home. We don't have nowhere else to go. But for an immigrant who knows the history of America, everyone generally knows the history of America and its mistreatment of Black Americans. They can't come to the country and say, oh, wow, y'all hurt my feelings because y'all are anti-black. Pay me now. No, the same way you wouldn't move to Ukraine because you know you and your family be eating dinner and a missile might come flying through your roof and you can't get mad at nobody but yourself. These black immigrants that moved here can't say, oh, black Americans, you got to include us in your reparations claim when they chose to move here. We didn't have a choice. And again, reparations is not to reparations is not to eliminate racism in American society. It may not even immediately get rid of the vestiges of the damage that's been done because of anti-blackness in American society. Reparations is simply to pay the debt that this nation still has not yet paid to freemen. That is it. And the fact is, we've already done a lot for black immigrants. We've done a hell of a lot for them because if it wasn't for us, the law that was passed in the 1920s, which pretty much only made immigration in America a phenomenon from Northern and Western Europe, which is another piece of evidence that there were almost no black immigrants in the United States from 1965. It was black Americans in the Civil Rights Act that got that law rescinded. But even now, we fight to keep some sort of equity in these courtrooms where if these black immigrants fail, they are being discriminated against, they can go to court and they can sue. That is their reparations right there. Go to court and sue. Be happy that black Americans fought and made it possible for black Americans to be able to petition a court. Because we lived in this country for centuries where that was not possible. But reparations, as it pertains to government-sanctioned anti-black racism, from chattel slavery to redlining, Jim Crow, land theft, burning down Black Wall Street, flooding our towns, and redlining, by the way, was legal. Redlining was something that was done by the FHA. They literally took out areas that were marked with a red marker. So that was legal. Reparations is payment for the unpaid wages and for the damages and lost opportunities that happen because of this government-sanctioned anti-black terrorism. It's not to deal with the vestiges or lingering anti-blackness in American society. Hell with them if they don't like me. Just give me my damn check and get the hell out of my damn way.
All right. So, lots of great information, lots of energy, lots of fire. I appreciate you both for sharing your nuanced perspective. I don't think we solved the question. I think what we did today is really just gave an opportunity for Michael to share his perspective about the 10 points. And of course, we could carry on this conversation for another couple of hours and to give Marcel an opportunity to talk about the specifics of his campaign platform about how repairing Black America repairs America. So, while we didn't solve it, I would like to give our guests, Marcel and Michael Harriot, a couple, 3 minutes to give their last words to folks who are speaking. And then if you could finish up your final thoughts to the audience with letting them know how to follow you and how to connect with you in your work. Of course, for those who are in the audience, please follow Marcel, please follow Michael so you can stay engaged with their work. And before we do that, though, before I turn it over to you two, I see Alexis has her hand up. Yes, ma'am. Alexis?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I was in my DMs there for a second and I had myself on mute. Really quickly, just wanted to make a quick announcement to everyone that the California Task Force is meeting again tomorrow and Thursday and it'll be streaming live. So I'll put that up in a tweet for everyone. That was all, Denise. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm glad you caught that. Thank you so much. Marcel, we'll start with you and then we'll end with Michael. So your
Actually,
final
Denise,
thoughts.
let Michael
Yes,
go first because he was already over time and he's already been gracious with his time. So I'll let
that
Michael
is
go
true.
first. That way, if he has to
Thank
go.
you. Thank you. Michael, yeah.
Sure. It was a good conversation. I feel like you know we went around in circles. Like I think on a lot of the points, but my ultimate point is that like if in my perspective, reparations are for the economic injustices that black to repair the economic injustices that black people have paid into this country and didn't receive our dividends, then that reparations extends past the limited amount of people in the California bill. And if lineage based reparations includes a racial component, my position has never been that everybody black should get reparations. My position is that limiting reparations to one specific category of people who America did this thing to, but not the other people that America did this thing to, no matter how small and no matter how big, again, because population grows exponentially. What we are talking about, again, is letting America off the hook for the debt it owes to the people it harmed. You can follow me though on Twitter. Everything, all social media platforms is MichaelHarriot. I write 2, 3 times a week for the Griot, a couple of times a month for the Guardian, and I have a book coming out, Black AF History: The Unwhitewashed Story of America, and the book specifically centers. Uh, the premise of the book is that the capital of Black America, what we call Black America, is the Gullah Geechee people. It is the premise is that Black America begins and ends in South Carolina. Thanks, y'all. Thank you guys for having me, and thank you for everybody who stayed for this conversation.
Well, that's a
And
good place.
thank you to Marcel too for inviting me.
No, thank you, Michael. And that's a good note on which to end it. The Gullah Geechee people. I always say people, South Carolina, people talk about Black Mecca. South Carolina was, and in my opinion, still is, and definitely can be again the Black Mecca. Y'all come on back home to the South. I want to say this, Michael. One, I will ask you if you will retract that article because I feel that I feel that the points we made here, and pretty much you pretty much almost made a case for lineage. You pretty much agree with it. Other thing you were saying to me is that if there are people, other black people who have been hurt by anti-blackness, okay, we acknowledge that, but that's not a reparations claim. Reparations is compensation for a wrong done. In the case of freedmen, Black Americans who are descendants of American slaves, and free blacks who lived during the time of chattel slavery and their descendants, that is for unpaid wages, that is for damages, and that is for lost opportunities that we face. Black immigrants were not even here pretty much in a very, very minute numbers until after 1965. So that is when the government pretty much rescinded and said that it was illegal to do anti-black legislation. We know the legacy still exists. Obviously, I wouldn't be running for Congress if the legacy of anti-blackness did not still exist. But reparations, which is the centerpiece of my platform, is to get the unpaid wages and the payment for damages and lost opportunities that this country was originally supposed to pay to my ancestors. That's the promise that was made during Reconstruction. They failed to do that. And then, the same way the Japanese didn't let them forget about their short time in the internment, The same way the Claims Conference didn't let Germany and the other European nations involved in the Holocaust didn't not forget about the Holocaust. We as freemen are not going to let the United States, the American federal government, forget about the American Holocaust and all the terrorism that happened thereafter. That debt was owed to us. So if your ancestor was not around at the end of the Civil War, like 1865, and was not emancipated, then you are not a person who's a payee from this debt. You are not. Now, if there are issues in society, racial inequality, you can solve that through other legislation. But what we're not going to do is make that a Freeman reparations issue. Freeman reparations is specific to us. If a person wants to solve other issues in society with racial inequity, that is something that they can do with separate legislation. But Freeman reparations is our debt. It's owed to us. The same way that property of mine, from the Port Royal experiment to Special Field Order 15, my family still has it, and we've paid tens of thousands of dollars to keep it. America still has the debt they owe to us, but the interest has accrued because, as you said, population growth has grown exponentially, and we, the children of those brave men and women who were emancipated at the end of the Civil War, we are the population growth. So the debt has grown, we've grown, and now the call for reparations has grown probably louder than it ever has since the days of Reconstruction. And as long as I'm around, I intend to keep lending my voice to it.
And with that, we will say thank you to Marcel. Thank you to Michael for sharing your thoughts, for sharing space. Thank you, Alexis. And thank you to everybody who is attending.
Hey,
For
Denise, may I say something real quick? If any of you listening can donate, please do, because look, we ain't gonna have, there's no one. Cory Bush, Cory Booker, Hakeem Jeffries, none of them are standing up like this for Black Americans, okay? None of them. I was just in Dorchester County. That's a county here in South Carolina. And it was mainly a white crowd there. And it was my turn to speak about my campaign. I went in. I did not water down my reparation centered platform. Now, there are other issues: illegal immigration, abortion, public schools, transportation. I spoke about all of that, but the main thing was reparations. What I'm trying to say to y'all is that the way I go hard in these Twitter spaces, the way you see me confronting politicians about reparations, that's how I'm going to be when I get to Congress. But the only way I can get to Congress is with y'all donations. So my donation link is in the Jumbotron. If you can give 500, 550, $15, however many you can give, I would really appreciate it. Every cent helps because I have to defeat this guy because he's never going to stand up for us the way I just did. Not even when it's easy. He's had a majority black district for 30 years, could have easily done policies for freemen and chose not to. He already shows us what he's about. I'm showing y'all what I'm about. So thank y'all.
Thank you, Marcel. The other thing that I was about to announce is that we're having a debrief